posted and everything.
Yeah.
Because that would be nice. I'm just gonna post this link again.
Yeah. No problem.
Cool. Where are you Skyping from again, by the way? Where are you calling from? Are you in Peru?
Yes, in Peru.
Cool.
Well, it's no time. So, well, we are here with Andie Moore, a libertarian activist and a vice-chairperson for SVL in Australia and New Zealand, and I discovered him in a very curious way because it was a link of a debate in Australia between him and a girl in a Trump hat in a libertarian event. It was. Can you tell us about that kind of episode? It was very curious.
Was this the debate?
Yes.
Oh, okay. So basically, I was running the first day of a conference in Australia. It's called the Friedman Conference. So like the Friedman Conference is our big like libertarian conference each year, and was asked to run like a day session, kind of about all student issues. And we decided to do quite a topical debate, and it was about nationalism. So it was like a debate between like two people on each side, all students for one. And the question was, is nationalism good for liberty? And it was quite a interesting, heated debate. I was the second speaker, and fierce, quite divided, because there's a massive divide. I don't know how it is where you're from, but in Australia at least, there's a big divide between like kind of more nationalist inclined libertarians and radically anti-nationalist individualist libertarians. So it was quite a big debate and stuff. Yeah.
It's interesting. I mean, I mean, how the question. I also saw your other video about. There are other video. I think another conference that you are also about left-libertarianism. And my question is how you came to, because you're from New Zealand, so how you became a libertarian and how you came to.
Yeah, that's interesting, because libertarianism, it's not like, if you look at places like the States, or you look at, I guess, like Europe or South America, we've got like, you've got like quite a large libertarian movement. There isn't really one in New Zealand. To it through a guy called Roger Douglas. And Roger Douglas, I don't know if you could call him a libertarian. He's probably more defined as like a liberal. He was our Minister of Finance in the 1980s, and he was responsible for our large economic reform, basically, like massive tax reductions, like cutting of subsidies, free trade and everything. He started it all. And I was like, New Zealand history, going like, wow, who is this guy? And I read one of his books. It was called Completing the Circle. And it was actually one of his later books. And it was about our liberal policy and like it was the New Zealand liberal policy revolution. And I just read through his book, and he's from the Labour Party, so he's quite socially inclined. Now he's in the ACT Party, but originally from the Labour Party. And I remember one of the chapters I read was on schooling, that he's talking about education, and one of his quotes was, "Education is not a business, but it should be run like one." And I used to be quite left inclined, like quite socialist, quite anti-market. I was like, I kind of thought the market would eventually lead to corruption. If you left the government, if you left business and the market do what it wants, you're going to have corporate control, corporate exploitation. But he kind of got me thinking about like market incentives, about like demand, supply, and how markets can be accountable to consumers and how markets can function like democracies. So I read him. Classic. I saw Ron Paul come up on my timeline, started watching some of his videos. And I accidentally watched a documentary on Friedrich von Hayek on the BBC. I was actually trying to watch the documentary on Keynes, because I was really into Keynesianism at the time. I was like, I really want to get into this. But I was like, damn it, I got the wrong time. I ended up watching the Hayek one. And I listened to it. I heard about how he predicted the Great Depression cycle, and I was like, wow, what is this? So I got into that. And then I ran to Ron Paul, a book by Tom Woods, because it was the only like Austrian school book we had in our library. Because I'm in a town of like, we're a city, but we're only 400,000 people, and that's the only Austrian school book there was in my library. Kept going down the stream, and I'm here now, I guess.
It's a very curious story. I mean, here in Peru, we don't know much about like near New Zealand or Australia. Actually, the funny thing is that New Zealand is easier to go to New Zealand because here they have like a consulate, but Australia doesn't have a consulate or an embassy here. So if you want to go to Australia, I have a relative that lives in Australia. She has to go like to first, when she wanted to immigrate to Australia, she went to Chile, and in Chile she did the paperwork, and then from Chile she take a plane to, I mean, it was, I think, some scales, but then to Australia. So it's kind of, we don't know much about Australia or New Zealand, but I think there is kind of music that kind of between the dance music of Calvin No and then some more indie rock bands and things like that. It's have like the very few things that I think in Peru, and I guess a general Latin America, we know about Australia and New Zealand.
I mean, fair enough. We're small countries at least. I mean, New Zealand's only like 4 million people. Like,
yeah.
I mean, at least for us, it's completely fine, completely justified. You don't know much. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really kind of interesting. I think the Cato Institute did a short story about the market reforms in the Labour Party, but how, I mean, you said that there is not necessarily a large libertarian movement either in Australia or New Zealand, but I guess that the fact that there are English-speaking countries makes easier, because still there are a lot of things in libertarian literature that are not translated to our language, and that make it harder to people becoming libertarian in other kinds of places.
It's a bit, I would say Australia's got a much larger libertarian movement than here. That's also like fact of numbers. Like, Australia's a bigger country than us, and of course, like, the larger country have more easier to specialize, and you have more specialized political traditions and stuff. Australia has had, the thing is, one of the funny things, it's kind of a good thing and a bad thing. We've almost got so little to fight against now. Like, we're actually like so economically free, and I mean, social freedoms were pretty good. It's kind of hard to sit down and say like, right, what are our libertarian issues to get through? Because you're like, well, we've got gay marriage. We're almost got euthanasia legalized. Abortion is mostly legal, well, like kind of decriminalized, but not completely legal. Our tax rates are pretty low. We've got like some of the lowest economic regulation in the world. The labor market's pretty free. It's kind of hard to sit down and be like, these are the issues we're going to work on, or these are the issues to get passionate about. Because we haven't.
Or in New Zealand?
New Zealand more so. Australia's got a few more. They're a bit more of I think their kind of state of government spending and their social freedoms are quite a bit lesser.
Yeah, there was a guy that was interviewed in the podcast of the Cato Institute, libertarianism.org, and he was saying that actually, even I think sex work is decriminalized in New Zealand, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I mean, we've had it decriminalized since I think 2003. In fact, New Zealand is now basically like the model that a lot of countries look to when we're trying to work out like decriminalization. And I mean, it's similar for gun rights. Like, we haven't got as free gun laws as like the United States or anything, but we've got pretty lax laws when it comes to gun ownership as well. And you go to somewhere like Australia, where they've banned most weapons as of 1996, and it's illegal to carry a gun in self-defense or use a gun in self-defense or any type of weapon, non-lethal or lethal, in self-defense. they actually look to us and say, well, why don't we copy New Zealand? And they say that about sex work. So it's kind of funny when you get to this point where you're like, well, we are kind of like the example for like libertarian policy. It's kind of hard to be like, so what to do next? How can we be more libertarian, you know?
It's very curious that, I guess, but I mean, it's really, I don't know, because you were saying of the smaller countries, but for example, Iceland has Girarsson. There's a guy, and Iceland is much more smaller than New Zealand, and this guy has kind of, I mean, it's very strange how, like, even being a very small country, the relatively center-right party has a lot of libertarian influence, at least on economics, and it's relatively, as far as I know, more free market in general than the other Scandinavian countries, and it was very funny because it was a smaller country, and as a smaller country it has much less libertarians, but for some reason the few libertarians there make more impact in the large political structure. And as far as I know, apparently there are some libertarians in the new Pirate Party. I don't know if there's a Pirate Party in Australia and in New Zealand.
No, not well. There used to be. Well, sorry, there are, but they're not really that powerful. A lot of, like, we kind of have our own libertarian parties with, well, libertarian parties in government, or in parliament, who've got some representation instead. But I saw that with Iceland, like, it was pretty impressive and surprising to see that the Pirate Party would have such a big share of the vote, considering Pirate Party is usually so kind of weird and special, particular.
Yeah,
so it's kind of, I was like, what the hell is happening? What is like?
Yeah, it's kind of strange in many ways. I suppose that yeah, it was a very curious way, but I don't know. I mean, it's very, and you were talking about immigration and how immigration laws are in Australia, because I mean, I know some things about, for example, the Canadian model, that is kind of like they generally seek immigrants that have either labor qualifications or university degrees, or for example, that have like expertise in a language, either French or English, depending on the region that they will go. So how are in Australia or New Zealand the kind of immigration requirements, or is it relatively free or relatively?
Relatively free from what I understand. I think I'm not an expert, so don't necessarily quote me.
Yeah.
But from what I understand, it's pretty free, and it's relatively easy to get a visa to come to New Zealand or Australia. At least for non-humanitarian immigration. Our humanitarian immigration is quite difficult and quite fucked up. But like, on terms of non-humanitarian immigration, it's pretty free from what I understand. Yeah, we have relatively free movement into New Zealand.
Yeah, I remember you were like in the debate about with the guy with the drum hat. You were talking about like the issues about of liberty beyond Western culture, and you were mentioning, if I'm not wrong, that some like libertarian individualistic ideas in Confucian thought, and also like Native Americans, that they have like pretty even anarchist kind of conceptions of the war, and how you came to that, because I think Roderick Long has written about Confucian thought and libertarianism, but the other communities, how do you research that? How you?
I mean, it's not necessarily my area of research, but from what I understand, there's I forgot the other guy's name, but Lao Tzu has quite a lot of writings on respect for each other, respect for the individual and property, and I think even goes closer to calling taxation immoral. And I mean, it's not even necessarily that they're, the thing is, this is the interesting thing. The whole, I guess that kind of whole sounds so social justice warrior, but the whole kind of basis of philosophy is in writing. So if your culture can't write, you can't record your philosophy. So it's hard to kind of go back and say like, oh, this society thought this society thought that. But if you look at a lot of kind of communal, if you look at a whole lot of societies, like Native American societies, a lot of them were founded on basis and of property and trade. What I kind of went out against in the debate was the idea that private property were fundamentally Western. Because sure, we have a largely market-driven society today, but it was hardly because that's a Western ideal. If we look at like the kind of people who suggested that we should move to a more market-driven society, like Adam Smith, people accepted in Western society at the time. Like if we want to look at like, if we want to look at today, like look at Western governments, they're hardly respectful of private property in many ways. What I think it's kind of hard to say is because our society, because our world has been so dominated by like kind of by colonial governments and by Western influence, it's hard to say what is a Western tradition and what is an Eastern tradition or an Oriental tradition. And what's more, what we tend to do is we tend to conflate the actions or the principles of government and principles of people. So we say like, of course, because it's like saying that markets, for example, are a Western tradition is like saying that you know, in China, state communism and authoritarianism is a Chinese tradition. Subject to an authoritarian government does not mean that those traditions belong to that country or belong to that culture. So my kind of thing was to kind of step back and say like, why do we have to root culture, like kind of the fundamental ideas of liberal values, which are which are respect, tolerance, like free trade, individual self-sovereignty. Those aren't things which are all meant to be linked to one culture. The whole idea is they are rooted in all humanity. They're natural human impulses. And the interesting thing, and this is my issue with a lot of libertarian nationalists, is they don't go far back enough and look at like the reasoning. And the whole idea in Adam Smith's text was to appeal to the human heart, the human soul, and what every human wants for themselves and wants for their society. So he kind of, when he was talking about treating each other as equals or a sense of justice or like a society based on free trade, he was appealing to that being something intrinsically desirable to all humans. So I kind of found when we were getting into this nationalist debate and people were saying like, we have to defend Western civilization because Western civilization is liberal, to kind of forget that the kind of tendencies of liberal thought are desirable, at least to the naked human of all races, of all cultures, not just to Western people. It's a bit of a rant, but yeah, that's kind of my like inner shebang going on, I guess.
Yeah, it's very interesting because I mean I live here in Peru and I have lived here all my life, and the funny thing was an article in Weasel magazine about by J.S. Walker, which is a great journalist there, and he was writing a lot of time ago about El Alto, which is a city in Bolivia, which is nearby La Paz, and he was telling the story about how he was linked to several articles about El Alto, about how this city is almost an anarchist city, but it's not an anarchist city in the concept of, for example, the Zapatistas, which are more of an anti-market anarchist of some sort. I think they are even running a candidate this next election.
Oh wow, interesting.
Yeah, but the issue about this is that El Alto is basically a city that was founded by people, especially indigenous people, is the overwhelming majority of the population there, and they, because it exists even before the independence. It was created by the people in the Tupac Amaru rebellion. Was a rebellion, indigenous rebellion that tried to expel the Spanish in colonial times, and they failed, but people went there and started to build their homes, and it's a city that now has like 1 million persons, but it's recently like 80s when the authorities recognized it as a city and has a municipality, but it had already thousands of people, and it's a very curious example because it's like a radical free market, because they sell everything there. It's like an open market in the middle of the Andes, and it's very curious because you can buy everything. Like there are bootleg copies of DVDs of different kind of films. There are people sell cars, people sell like everything, even weapons, even if they are not legal, like everything. It's very like curious because I mean I understand that probably when a lot of people think about a libertarian ideal, I mean probably a lot of people have been, and I think some people that are friends of the siester movement have been looking for a paradisiac kind of beach of place near the ocean and with a nice view. But and I know that moving to a city of 4,000 people, 4,000 meters above the sea is kind of ironic for that kind of people. But as far as I know, that is the most libertarian kind of city there is. I mean, even the police don't like to go there because when they try to like the population is very radical. I mean, they are not necessarily left wing in many sense, but the funny part was that that they bring down the more or less right wing neoliberal government that was in 2003. But when Evo Morales tried to raise taxes, they also protested against him. So it was that kind of people is very radical in many ways, and I don't know. It's really a curious.
Yeah, I find those. I mean, what I find is interesting. I can't say that I am like that. I really that's actually something I want to research more. Zapatistas look really interesting. As an example of like an anarchist society, but the interesting thing is when we envisage what a free society is, there's nothing to say that like a Zapatista-like society is like a kind of communal collective on broad markets, and people consent into that. There's no reason why we can't organize society like that. There's no reason why a libertarian society can't look like a large collective of people trading within each other up on the top of the Andes. I think ultimately what's interesting is like a libertarian society doesn't need to look like a more radical example of what we have now, of like not just you get to have a nice house if you want to, or like, you know, go on massive nice holidays if you want to, but also keep all your money and also choose your private health, your healthcare and your skills and everything. It's not just like everything now plus more choice plus more money. Society could look like that, which I find libertarians sometimes dismiss more curiously.
Yeah, I mean there are many ways to look at the libertarianism, and I have that's why I want to bring up the issue of left libertarianism as a libertarian that comes from the left. I remember probably one of the moments that made me more of a libertarian was when I was in the headquarters of the Socialist Party here in Peru, and there was a conference about the movement of the 60s of a very radical party that was I have forgotten their name, but the issue was that one of the members of this Marxist radical party was saying that he believed in the free market because he believed like the indigenous people during thousands of years have been like in market change, involuntary market change, which is order, and the idea of trying to erase that will be against indigenous culture, and he also said that the state has shown to be a failure. So the issue with the left shouldn't be like become win elections to impose more rules, but to try to fight against the rules that are kind of democratic.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I find it's almost similar here. Like for me, I find briefly before we get into other stuff, Indigenous issues, in at least Australia and New Zealand, are bigger for that reason. It's interesting. It's like one of the things Indigenous rights activists, from what I've heard, and campaigners call for is more self-sovereignty, more things for themselves. Indigenous issues are treated by the left and right as like problems the government needs to solve with more rules, more regulations, and more control. And that's the thing for me, it was one of the left-libertarian issues which pops up in my mind, is like a lot of Indigenous issues come from people wanting to just take back control of theirs, of what is theirs, which the state's controlled for so long and don't get to. So it's a similar thing.
I mean, it's a very curious issue, one of indigenous rights, because, for example, the left is not necessarily that good in that regard here in Latin America. For example, in Chile, which has, after the end of Pinochet rule, has had largely a social democratic kind of coalition in government. For example, has been very vicious against the Mapuche indigenous population, has passed anti-terrorist laws, have been like terrorizing, and people, like, it's very complex, because a lot of left-wing journalists don't want to make the social democratic coalition there like look bad, but on the other hand, I mean, it's something that is really serious. And on the other issue, for example, I mean, in Bolivia, it's a very complex coalition, because it's obviously Evo Morales, who is the first indigenous president, has had a lot of support from indigenous communities, but for moments he has also his fights with them, because he sometimes believes in a more kind of intensive mining industry that maybe some of the populations that live nearby the mines will like. So it's a complex relationship, and in Mexico also, I mean, it's very complex, because the left, it's more a urban kind of left. The place where as far as I know the left was kind of strong is Mexico City. But Mexico City, I mean, it's true that the lord of the people in Mexico City are partly of indigenous heritage, but they speak Spanish and they live in a urban environment. But the problems that the indigenous population have in indigenous areas, and the problems that they have because of a lot of times they don't speak Spanish, or they use their native language, and has a lot of problems. It's very different. So yeah, it's a very complex question, and I think that sadly a lot of times libertarians haven't put much attention in that.
It annoys me, because it's, I mean, for me at least, and I mean, it's certainly Australia. If you look at Australia, so Indigenous people were only recognised as humans in the Constitution in 1967. And I mean, if you look at the example of Australia, the whole founding of Australia is basically, they basically asked, give us your land. They said, well, no, we kind of live here. And Indigenous peoples being nomadic peoples, whenever Indigenous people left, the British kind of came and settled in it. When it was kind of places they would farm, and when they would kind of come back to their land, they would assume we have violence is being taken up against them, and they would then engage in like mass murder. Or there'd be other cases where Indigenous people were raped into submission or assaulted into submission. And it was blatant expropriation of all the land of Australia for British benefit, completely anti-property rights. And basically after Australia's land was completely stolen, Indigenous people were then sent into schools or removed from their families. And it's completely curious to me, because these are complete libertarian issues, but no one ever talks about them. You hardly ever hardly ever hear many libertarians talk about, native title, or you talk about restoring autonomy to Indigenous communities, allowing Indigenous communities to self-govern. A group kicked off their land, removed from families, deported, indicted. Like, when you think of an example of a group like that, who now has no property right and they just want to govern themselves, you think, well, shouldn't we be saying something?
Yeah, I think even Rothbard mentioned that in one of his writings, especially in his
Yeah.
New Letter. I think he mentioned that in Mexico, some of the land movements, the indigenous people were reclaiming their land, and yeah, it was kind of interesting that kind of reflection, and with that,
That
I was
was. I mean, I was going to say that if you look at like also what Rothbard's written on property rights, on property law, he said, I forgot exactly what the rule is called, but he basically said, you know, if I have a car, someone steals it from me, and then he sells that car to someone else, that is still my property. So if someone inherits that car from someone who's stolen the car, that's I can still have a claim to it. I can still take it back. This person who's stolen the car can compensate the person who just bought it, but it's still my property, and that's complete. You can completely apply that to indigenous issues. It can be hard to apply, but the principle is completely compatible, and it's not something which is brought up. It's one of like Rothbard's more kind of radical writings, I guess.
Yeah, and with that, I was going to your topic about LGBT rights. It's a very complex topic because, for example, the libertarianism, especially in the U.S. and to a certain degree in Latin America, I mean, it depends on what group do you approach, because SPL, I think it's relatively, since they are much more young, they usually tend to favor LGBT rights, but with older libertarians or I don't know, say paleo libertarians, like for example, LGBT rights is not a priority, or the like. For example, the guy over the Mises Institute was saying that it's not a libertarian position to support LGBT rights in Saudi Arabia or like things like that.
Yikes. Mises aren't aren't necessarily full of helpful libertarians for social issues, I guess.
Yes, I guess.
Yeah, it's disappointing. It's annoying. Because I think libertarians shouldn't just be looking at, you know, who coercion is being used against, coercion is affecting people, or this place in society. So you've got to. This is kind of one of the big debates in libertarianism. Is like thin libertarianism or thick libertarianism. It's kind of a debate about ethics, basically. I'll explain it if people haven't heard of it, but there's like just rooted in or anything. Sorry, my blank. Oh no. There's like thin libertarianism, which is just rooted in property rights. So it's like, I have my property, you have your property, you do what you want with yours, I do what I want with mine, leave it at that. Past that, nothing's moral, nothing's immoral, everything is just neutral. Thick libertarianism says, sure, you shouldn't be able to violate anyone's property rights. So that's like the non-aggression principle. Like you shouldn't be able to use force against someone else. But the kind of the ethics, the values which underpin not using force against someone else, and the non-aggression principle are ideas of respect for the individual, and agency, and kind of and value for humanity and for someone's being. And so it's not just enough to say like, sure, you own your own property and everything, but it is more ethical or more moral than other ways of living to act with one another in ways which maximize their agency or autonomy. So that means like opposing homophobia or transphobia, free voluntary actions that don't steal from anyone in themselves as just thoughts or things to say to people, but they make it harder for people to live their own lives or live as they want. It disappoints me when you kind of see people who say like, oh, you know, there isn't any inherent force when people are being homophobic, or, oh, well, homosexuality, gay marriage is legal now, we can leave it at that. It kind of annoys me because it ignores that, you know, regulations or laws against queer people or trans people, or homophobic and transphobic attitudes which still exist. It doesn't recognize that they have an ongoing effect in the ways that queer people can live their lives. I'm not really convinced that you can have a truly libertarian society if you feel like you can't go to school without being, if you can't go to school without being looked at weirdly, or have insults chucked at you, or being threatened to be cut off from your family for wearing a dress or whatever. Like, those are voluntary actions. You can voluntarily disassociate, but I don't think who's been kicked out is truly free in that situation. So it disappoints me when people kind of turn back on people who are still discriminated nowadays. So I think discrimination, while we should not use force to shut it down, I don't think using coercion is still just, but I don't think we shouldn't harbor discrimination in our own selves. So it disappoints me, I guess.
Yeah, it's very kind of curious, because this issue, I think the libertarians have been, especially the most younger libertarian generations in Latin America, has been good. But I think that still the left is confused by libertarianism. I don't know what are in Australia and New Zealand the most left-wing organizations, and how they see libertarianism, and do you have any interaction with them?
Yeah, I do. I've got quite a few friends on the left, I guess. I do associate broadly with left-wing circles while being a libertarian. I mean, it's just kind of seen as, libertarianism to them is seen as just, you know, it's like, do what you want with your own life as long as you've got the money to pay for it. Sure, if you know, have sex with someone of your own gender, or be whatever gender you want. Not if you're poor. If you're poor, you can't afford to do that. It's okay. That's or it's kind of a bit like, the thing is, in Australia, libertarianism has been seen as quite conservative, because libertarianism has been associated with the right. Libertarianism has been focused on issues of free speech and political correctness. So libertarians are also seen as like kind of free market conservatives, in kind of interpreting like social progress as being like, I don't know, anti-property, anti-capitalism, and therefore being kind of dangerous, or kind of interpreting like anti-racist movements as being inherently anti-free speech. So, I mean, it's kind of a bit funny. I think libertarianism in Australia gets a bit of a rap to being reactionary. In New Zealand, it's not really so well known of. There aren't many big openly libertarian organizations, or people don't openly call themselves libertarians. But in Australia, I think it gets being reactionary, or kind of a bit short-sighted, and not really criticizing inequality or poverty, but just saying, you know, yeah.
I mean, so in some countries there are kind of like movements are very kind of in fight against each other. For example, in Sweden, of all places, I was listening about the kind of fight between the more neoliberal kind of like libertarians that wanted like mostly economic reforms, and the other libertarians would also were kind of calling for immigration restrictions. So it's kind of a strange, I guess, in every country is kind of a different situation in many ways with respect of how to reach the left. I think that here in Peru, I generally side with the left, because I mean the left never has been government here, so of what we are going to accuse the left. So yeah, basically that, and the right wing have been in government like most of the history of Peru. So most of the damage they have been done and the regulation they have been done has been done by right-wing governments, which makes libertarians that have less left-wing sympathies, even they are basically politically homeless, because more or less there is not like a libertarian leaning party even here. I mean, even in Chile there is a small kind of liberal, classic liberal party, but here there isn't. And even Argentina, in other countries like there is, but here there have been attempts to create one, but never have like succeed, because sometimes the guy was the people generally leading these parties having like mostly people much more conservative leanings, and the most libertarians that are generally young, so they haven't backed them, and it's kind of and it has been like that for a while. And how you, like, for example, the socialists, the Trotskyists, are there, like, or the anarchists with, or the left-wing anarchists, what are the groups that are most in Australia and New Zealand? What kind of groups are there?
What kind of groups are there on the left?
Yes.
So, I mean, in New Zealand, I guess it's a lot more moderate. The Green Party is pretty big here. So a lot of people associated with like kind of the Greens, kind of like broad left-wing politics, and not necessarily like, you know, socialism now, like kind of left-wing politics, but broad, like, you know, social liberal. I mean, social liberal in the sense of like, you know, welfare state liberalism and kind of anti-austerity kind of liberalism. And there's a sizable Labour Party here as well. In Australia, the left is probably a bit more, probably a bit larger institutionally. In New Zealand, the left is a bit confused because it still hasn't made its mind up how it feels about Rogernomics, all of the economic reforms in the 1980s, because the Labour Party delivered them. So it hasn't really made its mind up whether it thinks it was a good idea or not, because they're starting to criticise child poverty and inequality in New Zealand, and they're starting to realise that they're starting to think that it might have been a cause of the economic reforms. In Australia, we have a quite Trotskyist left called the Socialist Alternative, who are active across all university campuses, and they're quite loud and vocal. They're not powerful, but they're vocal. You've got the Labour Party and the Party in New Zealand. Unions are quite a bit stronger in Australia, so you've got a vocal unionist left as well. Anarchists aren't really that big, I guess. You kind of see, it's like the anarchists in the United States. It's similar to that in Australia, I reckon. You go to an anti-fascist protest, they'll turn up. You'll see them in the black masks and the black hoodies and everything. You know, blacks and everything, but you don't really see them. There aren't many anarchist groups around. There are some centres in city centres, but they're not massive. I don't know of any still running in New Zealand.
Yeah.
So anarchists few and far between, unfortunately, but oh well.
I mean, here anarchists are not necessarily a big movement. For example, in Chile, they are huge and go to protests and relatively, yeah. So sometimes in Chile has a small population, but for some reason anarchists having their much larger movement there.
But I can imagine too, anarchism has a lot, from what I understand, it's got a lot deeper roots in Spanish and Latin American culture. There's a lot more writings you can access in Spanish from Spanish anarchist thinkers, especially because you also had, you know, Catalonia, you had all of the Spanish Civil War writings. For us here, we're kind of like, all of our works to be translated, except for the American anarchists who aren't that popular. You'd have to be translating, you know, like the works of the Zapatistas. You have to be translating like the Civil War writings. You have to be translating like Proudhon, Kropotkin, all of the writers. They're all in other languages. Like there aren't many English anarchists or American anarchists we can read, except for like the individualists. So
yeah, I guess that. Well, true that there is a story about a Bolivian anarchist who I think was the younger of the Spanish soldiers that moved to Bolivia, and he lost his vision and moved to the jungle basically, and he left there for many time. I don't know if he's still alive, but it's kind of an interesting story. But I mean, how you see the libertarian movement internationally in general? Do you think that it's going to be more sympathetic to left libertarian causes or issues, or do you think it's going to have more of a paleo-libertarian kind of resurgence with the issue of nationalism?
Oh, that's a really good question. I'm not sure. I think it will all depend on how Trump goes, really, how Trump turns out. you can already see a lot of the Mises Institute making ruthless attempts to defend Trump, or say, oh no, he didn't do this, didn't do that. I think it depends also on how long it takes, how long it is until libertarians realize their fight against political correctness, cultural Marxism, becomes apologism for fascism or nationalism, because it's starting to become that way with many circles, and it depends on libertarians associate with figures like Marty Yiannopoulos. Because libertarianism, I think one of the big issues is because of the rise of figures like Ron Paul, who were quite alternative. You had libertarians clung to things like alternative media and to a lot of kind of like internet, no offense to this, but a lot of kind of internet sensations and YouTubers really were quite like anti-SJW and quite reactionary. And I think a lot of libertarians followed that to go and move to join the like activists and anti-feminists, thinking that they were liberals because they were rebelling against things on campus and free speech culture. I think it depends on how long libertarians hang around with the hard right and the far right, and how long they realize that the fight against political correctness, if it so exists, like kind of goes against them. It depends on which allies they make. Because I honestly don't know what will come within the next couple of years, because things like elections are now so unpredictable, and you've got the European elections coming up, and you don't know how the German elections will fare, or how, I guess, like whole lot of elections will fare, and how many will turn towards far right parties. I think in terms of how successful left libertarianism will be, I don't know. I think it's hard. In New Zealand and Australia, we don't really have much of a basis. We don't have many organisations to jump off from. Yeah, I think it depends. I think left libertarianism will probably gain a lot more traction when people realise that the policies of conservative governments, nationalists, are moving towards more and more big government liberal policies to crack down on free speech, right to a fair trial, and the police state. So I think when starts to realise it's going in the wrong direction and sticking up for the wrong people, left libertarianism might rise again. But like, who knows? Like, who knows now?
It's a very international, like a patriot movement, like in the US or something like that, of people that don't think the laws are, or no.
Sorry, can you say that again?
In Australia, is there a kind of a patriot movement or something like that, that it's kind of like we don't accept the laws? Like, I don't know if you have like listened about the militia movements or things like that, like anti-government,
right? Like the patriots and the sovereign citizens and stuff. Yeah. Not really. No, not really. I think it's a very American thing, because it's very like 1776 revolution and everything.
No.
I don't know, not really.
Yeah, because it was kind of funny, because obviously for the internet, kind of the issues with Ron Paul became popular here in the north parts of Latin America, even, I mean, in other places more than here in Peru. But so it was kind of a very funny thing, because one of the most curious things that happened in the election was when Ron Paul, I think in 2007, went to Jay Leno, to the Jay Leno show, and he was talking about cutting government programs, about like repealing laws, and also about like pulling off the American troops from military base abroad. And actually after that, he was still there, but Jay Leno was introducing a band, was introducing Sex Pistols, and he said, and they were going to talk about a subject that you like. He said, look into Ron Paul, and he introduced like the Sex Pistols talking anarchy in the UK. It was very funny, that kind of combination, and it was kind of a very curious moment, because I think that Ron Paul people understood in some way the radicalism of libertarianism, and even if Ron Paul is by no means a left libertarian, he's fairly more critical than the average libertarian of corporate capitalism.
I mean, yeah, I think Ron Paul's thing as a political character, I mean, what I find interesting about Ron Paul is he's very much, I don't know why, maybe he took it from him or something, reflects Murray Rothbard so much, like it is so similar. You look at him and like Murray Rothbard, they had the same concern for, you know, corporate power, central banking, the obsessions of central banking and war are both very strong in them. They're very much like trying to look at how why we have a big corporate economy, why we don't have the small business economy we used to, why, you know, healthcare costs so much, why regulations prop up these big businesses and everything. And they're both almost like quite left-wing concerns. Imperialism are just like Rothbard's. They mirror each other, and they're both kind of left-wing. But at the same time, especially recently, Ron Paul coming to the end of his career, just as Rothbard did, they're both starting to look at ways at which kind of everyday Americans and everyday conservatives are being bullied around by progressives. And they're starting to bring around like big cultural concerns for, like, I don't know, free speech and for feminism, and they're trying to do a lot of critiquing of social justice. So it's interesting because they both have that very radical left tinge to them, but at the same time, they've got a lot of conservative cultural criticism going on. Because it's like Rothbard in the 1980s, he started to criticize sexual and racial equality as ideals. And it's like Ron Paul similarly now is going against the social justice movement, and he's talking about like kind of like, you know, how identity politics and feminism is ruining things on campus. So they're funny characters.
Yeah, it's a really curious kind of character. And I was thinking that it's very difficult to have someone like him. I mean, there are some libertarians that probably will try to run as a Republican and try to imitate him, but it was very difficult to copy him in all his splendor and his quirkiness.
Yeah.
This very particular kind of way of looking at the war, and it's really very particular kind of approach to politics in many ways, because I was thinking that I mean, for example, in Latin America, there are most of the I was trying to mention something that I have remembered about free banking. When people talk about, especially in U.S., about immigration, that people they are lovers of big government and things like that. I was remembering that there was an economist of the George Mason Institute that was saying that research in a podcast, that researching the economic history of Latin America, he was for some time at least there was free banking in Chile and in Colombia, and it was kind of strange because free banking is quite radical for even for a lot of libertarians oppose free banking.
Yeah, I mean, that was a cool funny thing, which I think drove kind of the weird radicalness of his politics while being in the Republican Party, is that he was an Austrian economist and criticizing banking, or the Federal Reserve at least, which is like a kind of almost a given for any modern economist, the Federal Reserve existing. It's just about how you work it. It was kind of quite weird. Because really, if you're a critic of central banking, the only other people who are on side really are communists or socialists, because they're like abolish money completely. Weird to have him, I guess, as a presidential candidate numerous times, the Republican Party criticizing banking.
Yeah, it was kind of fun. So yeah, I mean, it's really kind of interesting. I guess that no matter if there are paleo-libertarians or left-libertarians, I think that these years have, like, in my opinion, seen a resurgence of the Austrian school in general. Even in Spain, there are a lot of translations of Austrian economists, and it's very funny because the kind of the editor of that I have forgotten the name of the new editorial that is translating, but it's a very huge fan of car heads. I have translated car heads to Spanish, so it's kind of interesting.
Oh, great.
Yeah, it's. I think the first language which car has been translated is Spanish, so that's kind of cool.
Oh yeah, Carl Hess is. I need to read more Carl Hess, but I've watched some of his speeches, and he's so, as a character, so interesting.
Yeah, it's
as a guy, earning money. Like, God, what a you can't get more pure libertarian than that, can you? Right? Not paying taxes and getting told you can't.
I mean, he actually I more or less came to libertarianism when I read Carhes, which it's a very curious story because it has to do with Foucault. I was fan of an Argentinian professor of philosophy that had a blog, and he was a huge fan of Foucault and was writing about Foucault, and he was he wrote about Carhes, and I was saying this kind of character seems interesting, and I found it at politics, and I told myself I am a libertarian, and yeah, it was kind of curious that connection sometimes strange in between continental philosophy and libertarianism.
I was going to say, how did you get into continental philosophy? Because I find it really interesting too.
Well, because I was majoring in philosophy, so I was studying philosophy, and I found like Foucault, and it was kind of interesting here.
Because I think, I mean, I've got to read some of his later writings. I think Foucault has a lot to give to libertarianism as well. Because I think there's a lot to talk about in the way that language affects our politics, and the way that I guess the political discourse sets up dichotomies through which we can be controlled, and the state expands its horizons. So I think, like, I mean, I find them really interesting, like looking at things like the construction of like criminals, looking at the construction of how the government sets up criminals or groups to control as perversions, or dangers to society, which need to be controlled by the police. I think he's got a lot of there's a lot of potential in looking at him. I think looking at I think like a lot of his criticisms, like his exploration of homosexuality too, is like seen as some perversion which needs to be come out and controlled, as like an example of the way that the state exercises its apparatus. I find he's really critical to like a libertarian analysis, and we don't look at him enough. So I find continental philosophy, or like at least continental thinkers, we don't enough.
Yeah, the question to end this, and how you see the campus movement in Australia or New Zealand, or there's kind of the issue like in the US that people are trying to ban speakers and professors and kind of this, or is this more like some European countries where this is not much of an issue?
You see, I think some people try to. The thing is an issue because there are people who try to make out that they're being oppressed and being suppressed. Because someone calls their idea like racist or oppressive or discriminatory. We don't. I mean, we have people call out views on the campus, but we don't have. I don't think I've seen no platforming in Australia and New Zealand. We don't have a culture. I don't think we have an anti-free speech culture. I haven't seen speakers get banned in New Zealand before, or Australia, except for the exception of like student unions deciding they would not host a theatre for certain films, or for some movies. Like they had the Red Pill film, which is controversial, which a student union, so a private body, chose not to host in one of their venues. And the other exception being the student union in Auckland, New Zealand, saying that they would not register a white students' union, which is basically like a safe space for Nazis to organize.
Yeah.
But like apart from that, which are fairly rudimentary practices by private bodies, I don't think there really is a campus anti-free speech culture. At least not like in the States. At least from what I saw. Yeah, I think we're kind of pretty good in terms of free speech, at least.
Well, with that, I think we could leave it there. Well, it has been very interesting talk with you, and I have learned a lot about politics in Australia and New Zealand, which is I probably should check in that more. Thanks for being here. It has been a very interesting conversation.
Thanks for having me on. Thank you so much.